My wife asked if she could dance with her boss at the special company party, and I, swallowing a pain I couldn't even name, simply looked her in the eye and said, "Do whatever you want." I didn't scream. I didn't beg. And perhaps that was exactly what confused her. Freedom hurts more when it's not accompanied by care. She smiled, a little hesitantly, turned her back, and headed to the center of the room. And then, I saw it. The two of them laughing, dancing close together, his eyes on hers, his hand on the waist that was once mine alone, and the smile that was once mine widening in a way that seemed unprecedented, even after years of sharing the same bed. The loud music didn't drown out the sound of what broke inside me. And in that moment, without saying anything else, without making a scene, I simply turned and left. In the silence of that gesture, she lost her husband. But that wasn't where everything collapsed. That was just the first abyss. In the days that followed, I expected some reaction. A message. An apology. A guilty look. But what I received was the most deafening silence. No explanation, no attempt to undo the damage. And the more time passed, the more I understood, it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. She had chosen to flirt with the limits of what was acceptable, to test the strength of our love like someone testing a rope until it snaps. And it snapped. Not with screams, but with absences. Not with physical betrayal, but with emotional abandonment. And then, finally, when the castle we built crumbled around me, she tried to come back. She reached out to me with moist eyes, a trembling voice, with words of regret that seemed rehearsed too late. But I was no longer the same man. Something had died inside me that night. Something that, even with all the forgiveness in the world, could not be resurrected. She discovered, alone, that her boss was married. That all of it, the smile, the passionate dance, the playful glances, was just vanity. A wounded ego wanting to feed on the desire of someone who, for a brief moment, wanted to feel desired again. But the price was too high. When she realized she was just another in the line of vanities of a man bored with his own marriage, it was too late. She came running back, like someone waking from a nightmare and trying to grab the blanket of reality. And the blanket was no longer there. I was no longer there. I had already found a new love. Someone who didn't need to test me to value me. Someone who didn't play with the boundaries of respect to feel alive. Someone who gave me presents without needing to beg for attention. When she appeared, I listened. She said everything she perhaps should have said before the dance. She said she loved me, that she didn't know what she was doing, that it all happened too quickly. But all I could say was, "I forgive you. But I'm not coming back." I wasted too much time giving myself to someone who didn't know how to stay. And she fell. Not on the ground. Not at my feet. But inside. Because there she finally understood that it's not just about love. It's about decision. And she decided too late. The cruelest thing of all wasn't seeing her suffer. It was realizing that, despite everything, I still felt something for her. But it wasn't love anymore. It was just his shadow. And shadows don't embrace, don't kiss, don't return. Missing her came too late. And now she lives with the absence that belonged to me for so long. She lives with the echo of the days when I was faithful, present, constant. With the memory of the nights I waited, the mornings I made coffee, the messages I sent asking if she needed anything. She lives with the ghost of everything she threw away for a dance. And when she sent me her first letter, yes, she started writing letters, saying she dreamed of me every night, that she could still smell me on her pillow, that she cried when she remembered the sound of my laughter. I just read it. I folded the page. I put it in a box. And I didn't answer. She wrote others. One a week. Long letters, full of memories, attempts to reconnect the pieces that no longer fit together. She spoke of our plans, our lazy Sundays, the movie we promised to see together but never did. Each word hit me like a silent hammer to the chest. And still, I didn't respond. Because love that needs to be begged for isn't love. It's a debt. And I've already paid my share with interest. I kept each letter. Not out of anger. But because they're testimonies. Honest accounts from someone who learned the hard way that time doesn't go back and that forgiveness doesn't always go hand in hand with a new beginning. She stopped writing a year later. Her last letter said, "If you ever truly loved me, at least remember me fondly. Because I've never been able to love anyone the way I loved you again." And I understood. I finally understood. She wasn't trying to get back together. She was trying to say goodbye to who she was by my side. But the problem is, that version of her died with me. And now, all that remains are ashes blown away by regret. Life went on. For her, with the weight of a wasted love. For me, with the lightness of a love rediscovered. But sometimes, when the day ends and silence returns to the corners of the house, I think about the dance. The choice. The exact moment when everything could have been avoided. And perhaps the most tragic thing of all is this, knowing that love existed, that it could have worked, but it didn't. Because someone looked at it as if it were eternal, and eternal, it never was. It all began with a dance. A simple, innocent request. A gesture of freedom. But it ended with an absence. A silent farewell. A story kept in letters never answered. And the most curious thing of all, is that, among all the letters she wrote, one of them contained a truth that haunts me to this day. She said that, at that party, while dancing with another man, inside she only thought of me. And when she looked away and realized I had left, she knew she had danced for the last time in our history. Because it wasn't the kiss that destroyed everything. It was the lack of return. It was the, "do what you want," that night, rang louder than any cry of the end. But what she never knew, and perhaps never will, is what happened to the last letter she left. The one that came with a desperate plea, with a phrase that said, "If there's still a space in you, no matter how small, let me in." She received no reply. But that night, alone, with the letter in my hands and my new love sleeping in the next room, I did something that to this day I wonder if it was right or not. And that's what this story will be about. About choices. About loss. And about the reply that was never sent, but that changed everything, forever. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize betrayal, we condemn. All stories are fictional, but are born from deep emotional truths. Our goal is clear, to show how betrayal tears homes apart, corrodes feelings and destroys lives. Get ready to dive into a story intense, shocking and unforgettable. Take a deep breath. The truth hurts. And the story is about to begin. They met on a warm October afternoon, the kind that seems to drag time in slow motion, as if fate wanted to ensure everything was recorded with precision down to the last detail. He, named Daniel, was a discreet man, with a calm gaze and careful gestures, someone who listened more than he spoke and who carried a rare lightness in his walk, as if he weighed little in the world. She, Mariana, had intensity in her eyes. She was vibrant, spoke with her hands, laughed loudly, and had the kind of presence that filled a room even before a word was spoken. They both came from completely different backgrounds. He bore the marks of a silent youth, marked by loss and solitary overcoming, while she seemed to have been shaped by a rich social life, loving parents, and many choices made in the heat of emotion. And yet, there was something that inexplicably united them. As if each recognized in the other what was missing in themselves. The beginning was light. An exchange of glances, a leisurely conversation, a coffee that turned into dinner. There were no games, no doubts, just a raw, sincere connection that grew day by day. Their courtship soon followed, and their complicity emerged like an invisible thread between them. Daniel fell in love with the way Mariana laughed at things that didn't make sense, and she, with the way he observed her silently, as if effortlessly deciphering her. It wasn't long before they shared not only their days, but also their dreams. He dreamed of stability, of peace, of a house where he could finally feel at home. She dreamed of intensity, of recognition, of a love that required no explanations to exist. And although their inner rhythms were different, they learned to synchronize their steps. When they married, 5 years after their first meeting, everyone said they seemed made for each other. And perhaps, in some way, they were. The apartment where they decided to live was simple but charming. Natural light abounded, plants everywhere, many chosen by Mariana, who said a house without greenery was a house without a soul, and books stacked on the shelves Daniel insisted on keeping organized. Their routines were small, silent dances. He prepared breakfast, she did the dishes, he chose the wines, she thought of music for quiet Friday nights. There were no luxuries, but there was care. The kind of care you don't ask for. He liked to write little notes and stick them on the fridge, while she left notes in the form of touches, gestures, and silences. There was affection in the simplest things, in the glances they exchanged as they crossed the hallway, in the way he adjusted the strap of her bag before she left, or in the way she lightly touched the back of his neck as he read in silence. To outsiders, they were a solid couple, the kind that inspires stability. Close friends admired the way they respected each other, and even those who no longer believed in love were touched by the way they looked at each other. But like every true story, there were layers that aren't easily seen. Mariana, for example, always had a deep desire to be noticed. Not in the superficial sense, but in the innermost. She wanted to be recognized for her ideas, her emotions, for the way she perceived the world. At times, she felt invisible, even surrounded by love. Daniel, on the other hand, always feared not being enough. Perhaps because of the absences that marked his childhood, or the silences he learned to endure without complaint. And sometimes, this fear made him silent, withdraw inwardly, even when he was right there. Not because I didn't love her, but because I didn't know how to show it all the time. Life passed as it does for everyone, with bills to pay, plans postponed, unexpected fatigue. Mariana began to grow professionally, was promoted, and began traveling for work. Daniel, more stable in his career, maintained a more predictable routine, with fixed hours and well-defined responsibilities. Gradually, the time between them was invaded by silent absences. Not arguments, not outright fights, but the kind of distance that slowly sets in, like a fog that accumulates without you realizing it. There was still love, there was still affection, but the enchantment seemed to have taken a vacation. And perhaps that was all it was, a phase, a natural cycle of every long-term relationship. But what no one realized, not even them, is that the small silences were becoming abysses. She started dressing up more for work. She changed perfumes more often, changed her haircut without warning. She said it was for herself, and maybe it was. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. Sometimes he complimented her with a discreet smile, sometimes he just observed. Not out of indifference, but because he couldn't quite put into words the confusion he felt. He knew she needed admiration, but he couldn't understand why it now seemed to come more from outside than from within. And, over time, she became even more withdrawn. The man who had once been so present in every detail was now always one step behind. Mariana, for her part, missed the sparkle of the beginning. The notes, the questions about how the day was, the long conversations on the balcony. And even though she knew the love still existed, she began to wonder if that was enough. On weekends, he still waited for her with an open bottle of wine and a jazz playlist. She smiled, sat beside him, but she was distant, yet close. They talked about their day, the weather, family news. But they no longer talked about themselves. Their deep conversations gave way to comfortable silences, too comfortable. Mariana began writing in an old notebook she found in the closet. Random thoughts, reflections on marriage, phrases like, "Is loving someone enough when you're no longer seen?" She didn't show them to anyone, and Daniel would never touch anything that wasn't his. He also wrote, albeit in a different format. He typed and deleted drafts of letters he never sent. Sometimes he rehearsed words that would never come out of his mouth. Not for lack of desire, but for fear of destabilizing what still existed. Life went on. Mariana began to participate more actively in company events. It was part of the job, they said. Cocktails, dinners, short trips. Daniel supported her, with a smile on his face, but a slight discomfort in his eyes. He never voiced any discomfort, but he kept to himself the vague unease of seeing the woman he loved immerse herself in a world where he had no place. Still, he believed in the strength of what they had. After all, so many proofs of love had been given, so many moments shared, so many plans dreamed up together. It wasn't possible that all that could change. Or was it? An invitation arrived by email, Mariana's company's special end-of-year party. A large event, in a grand ballroom, with all the executives confirmed to be present. Mariana spoke excitedly, talking about the dress she wanted to wear, the dancing partners, and how important it was to maintain good relationships. Daniel listened silently, and although he wasn't a fan of large events, he knew he would be there for her. He'd done it before, and he would do it again. Because, for him, love also meant being present even when you don't want to be. Even when you feel out of place. That week, he watched her more than ever. She seemed lively, alive. She spent hours choosing accessories, researching hairstyles. He'd ask if she needed help, and she'd say no, but thank him with a kiss on the cheek. The days flew by. And the day before the party, he saw her standing in front of the mirror, trying on her new earring, her eyes distant, and wondered if he was still part of that reflection. But he said nothing. He walked away, made breakfast the next day, and went about his daily routine. When the big day arrived, he donned the dark blazer he only wore on special occasions. She emerged from the bedroom in a red dress that seemed made for her. She looked beautiful. He said so. She smiled and responded with a half-hearted, "Thank you." In the car, the drive to the venue was peaceful. They talked about traffic, the weather forecast, the latest episode of the series they were watching. But there was a silence floating between them. A silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but said more than any words. It was as if they both sensed something approaching, but neither knew exactly what. Upon arriving at the party, they were greeted with glasses of sparkling wine and practiced smiles. Mariana was greeted by several colleagues, with hugs, compliments, and invitations for photos. Daniel accompanied her with a polite, respectful presence, but one that made it clear this wasn't her world. And she seemed so at ease, so well adjusted, that he felt like an observer, not a partner. She spoke to everyone, smiled easily, her eyes sparkled. And he watched. Just watched. But that night, a request was made. A simple request. And his answer, or lack thereof, would be the first trigger. The first step in a story that still had no end. A story made of silence, choices, and letters that should never have been written. And at that party, where lights flashed and smiles multiplied, no one imagined what was about to be lost forever. The night of the party seemed tailor-made for Mariana. She moved with ease, as if the entire space had been made for her to move within. The red dress, the sparkle in her eyes, the confident posture. Daniel remained nearby, more like a gentle shadow than a protagonist. He didn't feel uncomfortable, but he didn't exactly feel part of it either. Mariana greeted everyone one by one, colleagues, directors, new leaders, each face eliciting a different smile. Daniel watched with that look of someone who understands, but feels. Mariana, in turn, seemed to absorb the energy of the event like a plant finally finding sunlight after cloudy days. There was something about her that Daniel couldn't decipher. It wasn't disdain, it wasn't contempt, it was more like a kind of enthusiasm he no longer knew belonged to her. But still, she remained firm, present, loyal. As she always was. Amidst the greetings, a confident-looking man appeared, with a low voice and discreet charm. He was Mariana's direct boss, someone Daniel had heard of but never met in person. They were introduced, exchanged a few small words, and then the man turned to Mariana with a smile that lasted longer than necessary. Daniel saw it, but pretended not to. At that point, he preferred to believe any discomfort was simply due to his own insecurity. The music grew louder. Couples began to fill the dance floor. Mariana smiled and looked at Daniel, as if trying to ask permission without using words. Then came the question. Simple. Soft. Raw. She asked if she could dance with her boss. And Daniel, instead of saying no, or yes, or explaining the turmoil building in his throat, simply looked at her firmly and said, "Do whatever you want." And at that moment, Mariana smiled with a look of doubt and turned toward the dance floor, where the two began to dance. The dance wasn't quick. Nor was it innocent. The unspoken intimacy was perceptible in the way they moved. The laughter, the surreptitious touches, the exchanged glances as if no one was around. Daniel remained motionless, standing, a glass in his hands, his heart shattering in silence. The scene before him was the opposite of everything he'd built with Mariana. He no longer knew where he'd begun to lose himself. Or maybe he did, but didn't want to admit it. She seemed different. Not just because of the dancing, but because of the way she reacted to that attention. As if she were thirsty to be seen. And there she was, being seen, desired, desiring, in the center of the room. Daniel said nothing. He didn't make a scene. He simply left. He passed through the glass doors, crossed the hallway of the illuminated ballroom, descended the steps, and breathed as if trying to come back to life. There were no screams, no scandals. Only silence. And in that silence, Mariana lost her husband. In the days that followed, Daniel didn't talk about the party again. Nor did he ask Mariana anything. He limited himself to minimal exchanges. Mariana, on the other hand, seemed unsure how to deal with the emptiness that had settled between them. She tried to maintain her routine, smiling as if nothing had happened, but her gaze betrayed the discomfort of someone carrying something unsaid. She knew he had left the party early. She knew he saw her. But she refused to open the subject. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of embarrassment. Or perhaps because she still didn't know exactly what she felt. Daniel, for his part, sank into a new silence. It wasn't the silence of peace, nor the silence of exhaustion. It was the silence of someone who realizes they've lost their place in someone's heart, but still remains there, out of habit, out of history, out of love, even though that love no longer has ground to stand on. Time passed. The distance between them grew silently. Mariana spent more time away. Meetings, trips, corporate dinners. Daniel kept the house in order, the daily chores, but without the same dedication as before. There were no more notes on the fridge, no unexpected messages in the middle of the workday. Just physical presence and emotional absence. One night, Mariana arrived late. The clock was already past 11. Daniel was on the porch, with an open book on his lap that he wasn't even really reading. She entered slowly, left her bag on the sofa, and went straight to the bathroom. She didn't say, "I'm home," didn't ask about his day. She simply disappeared between rooms. And it was there, in that gesture, that Daniel understood that the marriage was dying. Not for lack of love, but for lack of courage to keep it alive. There were days when Mariana seemed to want to talk, as if she wanted to apologize without using words. She sat closer, made coffee for them both, and asked about trivial things in a soft tone. But Daniel, already hurt, no longer knew how to respond. Her attempts sounded artificial, and even if they were sincere, they came too late. There was hurt in every silence, and guilt in every gesture. When their eyes met, they both knew something was broken, but neither had the strength to pick up the pieces. One Saturday, Mariana said she needed to travel again. A company event, a whole weekend away. Daniel just nodded. She packed her bag hurriedly, but with her usual care. Before leaving, she looked at him for a few seconds. She thought about hugging him. She thought about saying something. But she said nothing. She just left, as if she didn't want to awaken something that was already asleep. Daniel stood there, motionless, staring at the closed door. And for the first time, she felt like she was falling out of love. Not by choice, but by exhaustion. During that absence, Daniel searched for himself. He visited old places, walked forgotten streets, and reconnected with friends he hadn't seen in years. In a coffee shop, he ran into a woman he'd worked with in the past. Someone who, by chance or fate, also knew loneliness. They talked for hours. They laughed. They shared confidences. There were no kisses, no hidden intentions. Just the lightness of a reunion between two souls who had already been hurt too much. When he returned home, he felt different. More whole. More lucid. As if, for the first time in a long time, he'd remembered who he was before trying to be everything for someone who no longer knew how to welcome him. On the way back from the trip, Mariana tried to get closer. She brought a simple gift, a t-shirt she said she'd seen and remembered. Daniel thanked her. He smiled. But his gaze was no longer the same. There was something about him Mariana didn't recognize, a serenity bordering on indifference. And then, at dusk, they sat together on the porch. For the first time in weeks, the silence was broken. She talked about the trip, the meetings, the people. He listened. And in the end, she simply said, "I saw everything that night." "And you know what you did?" Mariana didn't answer. She just closed her eyes for a moment, as if to pause time. There were so many things she could say. So many justifications, so many excuses. But no words would be enough. The truth was before them. Clear. Irreversible. Mariana had crossed a line. Not with her body, though perhaps that was also true, but with her heart. The dance hadn't been just a dance. The laughter, the touch, the lingering gaze, all of it was a confession. And now, there, sitting beside a man she claimed to love, she didn't know how to go back. Because perhaps there was no going back. Daniel stood up. He entered the house. And when Mariana followed him, she found the room empty. His clothes were still there. The objects, the books. But his presence, that no longer existed in the same way. And that night, while Mariana cried quietly in the bathroom, Daniel wrote on his computer a phrase he would repeat to himself in the days to come: "Love, when it demands too much proof, becomes weariness." And even without saying it out loud, he already knew that everything had changed. But what Mariana didn't yet know, was that the hole was even deeper than she imagined. And that what would come next wouldn't just be the consequence of her betrayal, it would be the revelation of something that would make everything seem even more cruel. The morning she left the last letter in the mailbox was silent, gray, with a damp smell in the air and fallen leaves scattered across the sidewalk. Mariana walked slowly, as if each step pushed her toward a deeper, more real regret. The letter was in her hands, carefully folded, handwritten on scented paper. It was one of many she had left there over the past few months, and yet, this one felt different. It was short, but charged. Intense, blunt. She had stopped trying to convince. She had given up trying to explain herself. Now, all that remained was the veiled plea for a trace of humanity, a last shred of consideration. He wrote, "If there is still a space in you, however small, let me in." And she left, without waiting for anything. Without waiting for a reply. Because she already knew that, of all she had lost, the cruelest was the right to be heard by him. Daniel found the letter late in the afternoon. His routine had changed, his rhythms changed, his way of life changed. He no longer expected news of her. That day, he was more serene, more at peace than he had imagined possible just a few months ago. He sat in the living room armchair, opened the envelope, and read each line in silence. There was no anger. There were no tears. Only a kind of calm melancholy, like someone watching the end of a movie already knowing the ending. He got up, went to the closet, and opened the drawer where he kept the other letters. They were all there, organized by date, in envelopes marked with a handwriting he knew better than any other. He picked up the last one he had read, rereading random passages. Then he picked up the first. And then, unhurriedly, he began rereading them all. Every word, every sentence, every attempt. He spent hours there. The sunlight slowly faded, and before he knew it, it was already night. At that moment, something inside him asked for space. A desire not to return, but to close. To put a worthy ending. An ending that was more than an absence. An ending that made it clear, there was love. There was love. But it's over. The next day, he called her to talk. Mariana arrived with her eyes downcast and her shoulders heavy. She was dressed carefully, but there was a lack of radiance about her that was impossible to disguise. They sat on the same sofa where they had so often laughed, discussed movies, and sipped wine on cold nights. Now, everything there seemed ancient, sacred, untouchable. She began by saying she didn't expect forgiveness, but needed to be heard. She spoke honestly. She said she had lost herself, that she had confused need with need, desire with abandonment. She admitted she had searched outside for what she might not even have known still existed between them. But in the end, what she found was emptiness. She said the boss wasn't who she thought, that it was all just mutual vanity. He didn't want her. He wanted the feeling of being desired. And she, out of pride, played along. She cried as she spoke. She apologized. She didn't beg, she didn't demand. She just wanted to show she knew where she had gone wrong. Daniel listened to her. Silently, as always. With a look that hurt more than any answer. When she finished, he stood, went to the bedroom, and returned with a box in his hands. He handed it to her. Mariana opened it slowly. Inside were all the letters. Read. Folded. Carefully kept. Each one, kept as if part of a story he didn't want to forget, just leave in its rightful place. She cried again. Not because of the rejection, but because she knew, then and there, that even though she'd been forgiven, she'd never be welcomed back into that space. Daniel then spoke. His voice firm, low, filled with something almost tender. He said he'd loved her with everything he was. That he'd given everything. That even in silence, even in his final days, his love was still there, hanging on the walls, in the smell of the house, in the memory of their touch. But that, after the betrayal, something changed. Not just because she'd danced with another man, but because she hadn't come back. She hadn't chased him that night. She hadn't explained. She hadn't fought. She'd simply let time cool everything. She'd said forgiveness existed. But sometimes forgiveness and return are different paths. She asked, her voice breaking, if he had fallen in love with someone else. He hesitated for a moment. He said he had found someone again. That it wasn't love yet. But it was peace. And that for the first time in a long time, he felt light. And that was what he wanted to carry from then on. Mariana nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't make a fuss. She simply said she would understand if he never wanted to see her again. Daniel replied that it wasn't about wanting or not. It was about knowing that some stories need to end at the right time, so as not to destroy all the good things they had. She got up, walked to the door, paused for a moment, turned, and asked, "But why haven't you ever replied to my letters?" Not a line, not a word. He took a deep breath. He said each of her letters had been read carefully. That he felt everything. That some had made him cry. Others had made him smile. But that, deep down, he knew she needed to write for herself, not for him. And that the lack of a response was, in itself, the answer. Mariana left that night with the box in her arms. There was no storm outside, but it was raining inside. She got in the car and stood there, motionless, for several minutes. Then he turned on the radio. He drove aimlessly. He stopped in a square. He cried again. And then, on impulse, he decided to drive past their old house again. Just to see. Just to feel. He parked on the corner. The living room window was lit. But what she saw there changed everything. Daniel was on the porch with another woman. A woman with a calm expression, serene eyes, a light smile. They weren't touching. They weren't glued together. But there was something between them, something Mariana recognized. It was the same look that had once been hers. The same smile. The same silent surrender Daniel offered only to those he truly loved. And there, parked in the dark, she understood she had lost. Not just her marriage. Not just her partner. He had lost the love of his life. Days later, she wrote her last letter. The shortest. She said she understood everything. That she no longer needed answers. That she was grateful for every memory. And that if he ever remembered her, it would be with lightness. That he would remember the trips, the laughter, the dog adopted in the rain, the cake burned on their first Christmas. And that he wouldn't remember the dance. That he wouldn't let this last memory erase all the others. She left the letter in the same box, even though she knew he might never open it again. But Daniel read it. And when he finished, he went to the drawer where he'd left a letter he'd never sent. A letter he'd written shortly after his reunion with the woman from the cafe. It wasn't a letter to Mariana. It was to himself. In it, he confessed something he hadn't said out loud until that point, that the dance had hurt, yes. But what had hurt most was knowing that Mariana hadn't fallen for her boss's game out of desire, but out of need. Out of pride. Out of vanity. That she wanted to prove to herself that she was still desired, and in the midst of it all, she'd forgotten she was already loved. She'd forgotten she already had everything. And yet, she'd traded everything for a fleeting moment of validation. But what he hadn't expected, that night he read the last letter, was to find another revelation inside that box. Something he himself had kept and forgotten. A loose sheet of paper, different from the others. In it, Mariana had confessed, between the lines, that her boss, the man she'd danced with, had discarded her that same night. That she'd been left alone in a hotel, without warning, without a word. That he'd used her as bait, as a shield, as a distraction for other interests. That she only discovered his marriage days later. And that the feeling of being used was what finally made her understand what Daniel had been to her all those years. The paper trembled in her hands. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pleasure at her pain. It was a strange kind of regret, the kind only felt by those who have truly loved. But now, everything made even more sense. The silence. The shame. The letters. The empty gaze. She hadn't just betrayed. She'd been betrayed the very moment she chose to betray. A cycle of vanity that closed in on her. Mariana lost everything for a dance. But she lost even more for not knowing how to get back in time. And Daniel now knew that his pain was a mirror of another pain. That, in the end, they were both victims of bad choices. But only he knew how to start over. And in the silence of the room, with the last letter in his hands, Daniel finally smiled. Not for revenge. But for peace. The peace of someone who had lived through everything. Suffered everything. And now, finally, he was ready to close the door without weight, without regret, and with the certainty that he had done everything he could. The day dawned sultry, with the sky partly cloudy and the air thick as if foreshadowing a storm that, deep down, had already begun within them long ago. Daniel woke earlier than usual, even without an alarm clock, as if his body already knew something needed to happen that day. She got up, put on her slippers, and went straight to the kitchen to make coffee. Her movements were calm, almost automatic, but her heart beat faster than it should. Since reading the last letter, the truth seemed to have unfolded within him in deeper layers than he had imagined. It wasn't just the weight of having been betrayed, it was the awareness of how much Mariana had also lost herself in the process. Both had sunk in different ways into the same absence, and now, what remained was the final choice, to end or prolong a story that, in essence, had already said its goodbyes. Mariana, on the other hand, woke with a bitter taste in her mouth and a pang of anguish that tightened her chest, as if she'd been running for hours without moving. Since her last meeting with Daniel, since delivering the letters, since their silent goodbye at the door, she knew the end was more real than ever. But there was still something she needed to say. Not for herself, but out of respect for what they'd shared. She felt that if she didn't say it, if she didn't look into his eyes one last time, something inside her would remain unfinished forever. He got in the car late that morning and drove without much thought. He passed places that had once been part of their shared path and realized how much had changed. The city seemed the same, but there was a strange emptiness around every corner, as if everything they once shared was now a memory of a life that no longer belonged to either of them. Daniel was sitting on the porch when she arrived. He didn't get up immediately, but he didn't show any surprise either. He just looked at her with that steady gaze that said everything without raising his voice. Mariana walked slowly toward him and asked, in a low, almost resigned voice, if they could talk. He made a discreet gesture with his hand, indicating the chair next to him. They sat for long minutes, without saying a word. Only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the distant footsteps of a child playing in the yard across the street broke the silence. Until she took a deep breath and began. "I didn't come to ask for anything. Not a fresh start, not an apology, not reconsideration. I only came because something inside me still needed to look at you as a man, not as mourning," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if watching the words dissolve into thin air. "When you left that night, I felt it. Not immediately. But hours later, already in the hotel, alone, sitting on the edge of the bed, I understood. The dance was just a reflection of the mess I was already in. I wanted to be desired, but I didn't realize I was already loved. And there, when I realized what I'd done, I didn't have the courage to go back. I was ashamed. And when I wanted to, it was too late. You were already gone, even though your body was still at home," she continued, trying to control her breathing, as each sentence unraveled a part of what still tied her to the past. Daniel finally turned to her. His eyes weren't hard, but they held a depth that made her look away for a moment. "You weren't wrong for dancing," he began, with a calmness that surprised even himself. "You were wrong for remaining silent afterward. For choosing to hide behind pride when love was still here, trying to breathe. You left me doubting for days, made me feel crazy, imagining things, and when you knew I saw, you chose silence. That killed what was left. Not love, but respect. And without respect, love becomes a wound." Mariana closed her eyes and swallowed hard. "I hated myself for that. For not knowing how to get back. I thought giving you space was the right thing to do. That you needed time. But really, I was hiding. And every time I wrote, every letter, every line, it was a cry for help. But I know I don't deserve to be here anymore," she said, tears welling in her eyes, but not letting them fall. Daniel lowered his head, rubbed his hands on his knees, and said something she never expected to hear. "You were used, Mariana. And I knew it. From the beginning. I got that message, from a friend at work. They told me that very night. That you'd been seen alone at the hotel, crying in the lobby, without even getting an explanation. That he'd left you there, as if you were disposable. But I couldn't look for you. I was angry. Not just at you, but at myself. For allowing you to get to the point of seeking in the other what we lacked." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You knew." He nodded, then added, "And that's what destroyed me the most. Knowing you made a mistake, yes. But you also suffered. And even so, I couldn't be the man who reached out. I closed myself off. I protected myself. I kept quiet. And I left you bleeding alone. Mariana couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She tried to say something, but her voice faltered. Daniel leaned in a little closer, not as someone who forgives with the promise of a return, but as someone who finally understands that they both made mistakes in different ways, but with similar consequences. You didn't lose me in that dance, he said with a heavy sigh, you lost me in the silence of the following days. When I was ready to listen to you, you disappeared. When I felt again, you no longer sought me out. And when you started writing, I was already starting over. She tried to smile, but only managed to purse her lips, like someone accepting the sentence of a court they already knew was lost. I loved you with everything I had, Daniel. Even when I made mistakes. Even when I lost myself. And if that still means anything, I want you to know, that you were my greatest love, she said, with a sincerity that wounded and healed at the same time. Daniel nodded slowly. And you were mine. But not every great love has to last forever. Sometimes, it just comes to teach us what we accept and what we should never repeat. I forgive you. Not for what you did. But because I need to move on without the burden. And because what we lived, was too beautiful to be buried with resentment. They fell into silence again. Long dense. Then Mariana stood. He took one last look at the house that had been his home for so long. He touched the door frame as if saying goodbye to a memory, and walked to the gate. When he left, he didn't look back. Daniel didn't go to the window either. Neither of them needed any more confirmation. Their story had ended there, without screams, without despair. Only with the certainty that it had been love, but now, it was no more. Days later, Daniel received a message from the woman he'd met at the cafe. It was a simple invitation to dinner. He responded with a calm yes. There was no euphoria. There was maturity. And for the first time in a long time, he felt he could move forward without fear. Because now he knew the value of surrender, but also the weight of loving someone who didn't know how to stay. While Mariana, elsewhere, slowly unpacked the box of letters, putting each one in a new envelope, with old dates and scents that now existed only in memory. Time would do its work. But there, between written words and dried tears, she understood, that losing a true love out of pride, need, or distraction is like letting a star go out in the middle of the night, thinking it will still shine in the morning. And the most painful thing of all wasn't losing him. It was understanding that I would never be loved like that again. And that I would never again have someone who, even hurt, still held on to every piece of the love they shared, until the end. From the moment Mariana crossed that gate for the last time, a different silence settled within Daniel. It wasn't the same kind of silence that enveloped them after the betrayal, nor the silence that precedes an emotional outburst. It was a resolute, mature, peaceful silence. Something that no longer carried anger or sharp pain, but also had no room for longing. It was the kind of emptiness that comes when you've done everything that needed to be done, when you've said everything that needed to be said, and yet, the echo of a life that will never return remains. Daniel spent the following days with a strange lightness in his shoulders. Not because he was happy or relieved, but because he had finally brought a story that had consumed him completely for too long to come to an end. He began to reorganize the house, not as someone purging memories, but as someone deciding to breathe new air. He took down the picture frames that still held frozen moments of a love that no longer existed, folded clothes that had been stored away since last summer, and even moved the plants around, as if he wanted to reconfigure the space so that it would no longer whisper memories at the end of the night. Meanwhile, Mariana was going through a much slower and more arid process. The forgiveness she received didn't bring her peace, it brought clarity. For the first time, she was being forced to deal with her choices without the distraction of other people's guilt. There was no one to blame, not even himself. All she could do was live with the fact that she had wasted something rare, something many people spend their entire lives searching for and never find. In the days that followed, she tried to occupy her mind with work, with courses, with small renovations to the apartment. But in every corner, in every empty space, she found signs of what she had lost. And worst of all, the love was still there inside her, pulsing, active, but with no place to live. There was no body to embrace, a voice to call, a home to return to. It was an orphaned love. And there is no pain more cruel than loving someone who still exists but no longer belongs to you. Daniel gradually rediscovered his identity. He began writing more frequently, something he'd always enjoyed but had neglected during the years he'd spent trying to maintain a single marriage. He rediscovered the pleasure of walking aimlessly, of sitting in bookstores for hours, of chatting with strangers about trivial matters. And it was in this almost involuntary process that he began to grow closer, more naturally, to the woman he'd reconnected with months earlier, the same woman from the coffee, the spontaneous laughter, and the effortless conversations. She was everything Mariana had never been, simple in her needs, generous in her words, serene in crises. There was no excessive intensity, no hidden insecurities, no constant demands for validation. There was an honest exchange, in which each gave themselves in the right measure, without needing to beg for space or prove their worth. And, little by little, without hasty promises, that relationship began to blossom with the naturalness of something that had always had potential but only now found the right time to happen. Mariana learned this not through gossip or social media, but because she felt it. On a casual trip to the supermarket, she saw him from afar. He was with his new wife, laughing at something she'd said, holding a bag and a bouquet of simple flowers. The scene was almost banal, but for Mariana, it carried the weight of a sentence. For the first time, he wasn't the serious, wounded, restrained Daniel she was used to seeing. He was a different man. A light, available, whole man. And it hit her in a way no returned letter, no silence or negative response had. Because now she saw that it wasn't just the end of their relationship. It was the rebirth of someone she'd unintentionally destroyed. And this realization couldn't fit into any text, not even the most sincere letters she'd written. She returned home and cried. But not a desperate cry. It was a slow, resigned cry, the cry of someone who finally accepts that time waits for no one, and that love, when mistreated, becomes a memory, no longer a home. In an unexpected encounter, weeks later, Mariana and Daniel crossed paths again. It was a get-together hosted by an old mutual friend, someone who insisted they both attend, even though they knew it would be awkward. Daniel arrived accompanied. Mariana, alone. When their eyes met, there was no tension. Only a silent awareness that time had already done the work they, as a couple, had failed to do. For much of the evening, they remained in different circles, respecting each other's space. But in the end, as they said goodbye, they ended up crossing paths in the garden of the house, where yellow lights illuminated the trees and the sound of distant conversations served as a backdrop to a moment that, though brief, would be memorable. Daniel was the first to speak. He said she was fine, his tone genuine, without any irony or reservation. Mariana responded with a small smile, thanking him. There was a pause, and then she asked how he was. The answer was short but full of meaning. He said he was at peace. And in that moment, Mariana understood that it wasn't just a catchphrase. It was true. He was. She could see it in his eyes. And that, more than any letter or explanation, closed their story with the dignity she hadn't been able to build on her own. They parted with a light hug. And in that embrace, everything that remained between them melted away. The hurt, the questions, the burdens. There was no more debt. Only memories. In the following days, Mariana tried to reclaim her life with greater awareness. She knew there was no point in seeking new relationships without first healing the flaws that had led to her failure. She began therapy with greater commitment, looking inward more seriously, seeking to understand her own emotional needs, her patterns, and the holes she had always tried to fill with external validation. It wasn't a quick path, nor an easy one. But for the first time, she was walking without trying to rush. She was seeing herself as someone who didn't just want to justify herself, but to rebuild herself honestly. She stopped writing letters to him. Not out of giving up, but out of respect. Because she understood that, now, he was no longer an unfinished chapter, but a book she needed to leave on the shelf. Daniel, on the other hand, was beginning to experience a more subtle kind of happiness. It wasn't made of euphoria, nor of unbridled passion, but of small, everyday joys. The new woman he was with didn't try to occupy spaces that didn't belong to her. She didn't want to be a comparison, nor a replacement. She simply offered presence, affection, and freedom. And that was enough. They made plans, but without rushing. They went to the movies, cooked together, read silently in the living room on Sunday afternoons. And in these small exchanges, Daniel began to realize that true love isn't made of grand gestures, but of the constancy with which one chooses another, even on ordinary days. He knew that this new love didn't erase the previous one. But I also knew that, however painful the end had been, it was necessary for this new beginning to have space to flourish. At the same time, Mariana began to rediscover her own path. She rekindled old friendships, rediscovered forgotten hobbies, and took a short solo trip to a place she'd always wanted to visit. During this internal journey, she began writing to herself, no longer as a plea, but as catharsis. She began recording her thoughts, her processes, her discoveries. She discovered that the emptiness she felt wasn't just missing Daniel, but an absence of herself. Because for years, she had molded herself to what she believed love required, without realizing she was nullifying herself. And now, finally, she was beginning to understand her own worth without needing anyone's confirmation. She didn't know when she would love again, or even if it would happen. But for the first time, it didn't matter. And so, between endings that didn't ask for permission and new beginnings that weren't planned, life went on. But before the outcome, before each person finds what they truly deserve, there's still something that needs to happen. A final gesture. A silent choice. Something that will define, once and for all, what each person will take with them forever from the story they lived. Something that hasn't yet been said, but is about to be revealed. There was a particular afternoon in June when the wind blew with a milder chill, cutting slowly through the cobblestone streets of an old neighborhood Daniel used to frequent when he needed to find silence. It was a simple place, with cafes hidden behind fogged-up windows and dusty bookstores where one could spend hours uninterrupted. It was in this setting that he decided to stop, on a random Saturday, to review some ideas he'd been jotting down in old notebooks, stray reflections, incomplete sentences, fragments of himself that were slowly beginning to make sense outside the emotional chaos he'd experienced. Sitting at a corner table, watching people hurry past on the narrow street, he leafed through the pages with a light, almost contemplative gaze, as if viewing his own life through external eyes. For the first time in a long time, he carried no expectations about what would come next. He was simply present. And this silent presence became, day after day, the fertile ground where wounds healed quietly. Across town, Mariana had accepted an invitation to a creative writing course. Not that she dreamed of being a writer, but writing had become her only reliable refuge in recent months. She no longer left letters in mailboxes or sent messages after hours. But she wrote, daily, as a ritual of reconstruction. That afternoon, the class theme was real endings. The proposed exercise was simple: narrate the end of something important without embellishments, without metaphors, just with the raw truth. Mariana hesitated for several minutes before beginning. The blank paper seemed to mock her own inability to put a definitive end to the story that still inhabited her. But then she took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, she wrote, "Ending isn't stopping loving. It's accepting that love alone can't sustain the weight of two absences." From that moment on, the words came like a river dammed for too long. And when she finished, she didn't cry. He just looked at the text with the calm of someone who knows he is finally freeing what has been trapped inside for too long. Days later, Daniel was invited to give a short lecture at a local university. The topic was emotional reconstruction and overcoming grief, a subject he knew not through theory, but through life. He accepted the invitation without hesitation. He wanted to share, discreetly, what he had learned. At the end of the lecture, while gathering his notes, he was approached by a young woman who asked, with attentive eyes, if he had ever forgiven the person who hurt him. Daniel smiled serenely, looked at her, and said, "I forgave the mistake. But it took me longer to forgive the silence that followed." The answer made a visible impact. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. And he knew that many in the audience carried similar stories. Stories that don't end with screams, but with absences. Stories that leave holes instead of scars. Meanwhile, Mariana was invited to publish one of her texts on a local literary blog. The article spoke of loss and learning. It didn't name names or mention obvious details, but it was filled with genuine emotion. When it was published, a reader commented something Mariana would never forget: "You managed to turn your pain into a bridge, not a wall." That phrase would stay with her in the days to come as a reminder that, even if she hadn't been able to save her love story, she could still save herself from emotional ruin. And that, she now understood, was true redemption, not going back to where she'd gone wrong, but not repeating the same steps with others, or with her own soul. A month later, on an unexpectedly sunny Sunday, they were both invited to the 70th birthday of a former professor who had touched both of their lives during their college days. Daniel hadn't intended to go, but was encouraged by his current partner, who, with sweetness and maturity, knew that certain gatherings weren't about nostalgia, but about healing. Mariana also hesitated before confirming her attendance. But deep down, I knew I needed that final meeting, not as a fresh start, but as closure. The event would take place in a secluded location, surrounded by tall trees, rustic wooden tables, and the smell of leisurely food that permeated the air from the moment they arrived. It was a place where time seemed to pass differently, with more ease and less haste. When Daniel arrived, he recognized old colleagues, exchanged sincere hugs, and chatted naturally. Mariana arrived later, alone, dressed simply, but with a different aura, less tension, less expectation. When they saw each other, there was no surprise. No nervousness. Just a discreet wave, followed by a slight smile. During the party, they kept to separate groups, respecting their own history without forcing unnecessary encounters. But as the sun began to set, Daniel decided to move away a bit and went to a more secluded part of the grounds, where there was a small lake with stone benches around it. Mariana, noticing him there, couldn't resist the urge to approach. She sat beside him without asking permission, but with a silent respect that he immediately recognized. They stood there for a few moments, watching the still water reflecting the clouds. It was Daniel who broke the silence, saying that the landscape reminded him of his childhood, of the places he used to run with his brothers, of a time when fears were different. Mariana responded with a comment about how time was both merciless and generous at the same time, merciless because it takes away everything we neglect, and generous because, even so, it offers us other chances. The conversation flowed smoothly, without demands, without overly specific memories. They talked about the paths they were taking, about how they had transformed themselves, about how they now saw love differently. Mariana confessed that she feared she would never love the same way again, and Daniel said he understood, but that perhaps it wasn't a question of intensity, but rather of awareness. That loving consciously was harder, but much safer. She looked into his eyes and, with a lump in her throat, thanked him. Not for that moment, but for having once been the man who taught her what true love was. And he responded with a silent thank you, the kind that doesn't need sound to be heard. When they returned to the party, it was already dusk. The lights in the tree branches were beginning to twinkle like lazy stars, and the music in the background was soft, almost imperceptible. Daniel said goodbye early, he needed to get back. Mariana stayed a while longer, chatting with old friends, feeling, for the first time in a long time, at peace with herself. When he returned home, he wrote another page in his notebook. Not a letter, but a text that ended with, "Today, I understood that it's not about recovering what was lost, but about honoring what was lived and moving forward lightly, knowing that some people don't stay forever, but shape the best of who we are when life demands courage." And so, between unexpected encounters and silent conversations, their story unfolded like a melody that gradually slows down until it ceases completely. It wasn't the end yet. Only one final decision remained. One final word. A gesture that, subtle and definitive, would provide the most dignified ending a true love, even a wounded one, can receive. And that moment was on its way. At the end of that winter, Daniel stood before his old bookshelf, rearranging titles, removing volumes that no longer made sense in their new phase, and making room for new beginnings, literally. The house had changed. Not in the furniture, but in the energy. Now, there was a warmer light, a quiet tranquility that required no words, a sense of belonging that arose from everyday life rather than necessity. He and the woman beside him shared a relationship built without noise, where nothing needed to be proven, where love came not as a demand but as a welcome. In the small, everyday gestures, like preparing dinner together or reading silently at night, there was a solidity Daniel had never experienced before. He knew that this woman would never fill the place of someone who had left, because that was not her role, and precisely for that reason, she became even more essential. With her, Daniel discovered that true love is not based on emotional intensity, but on constant presence, on emotional peace, on honest reciprocity. And there, in that house, he could finally breathe the relief of having survived his own story without letting the pain define him. Mariana, for her part, followed a slower, more solitary, but no less transformative path. After their last face-to-face encounter, something calmed inside her. There was a bitter but liberating understanding that the love she lost would never be replaced. It was a kind of love you only experience once, and when broken, it leaves scars that don't bleed but also never completely heal. She accepted this with the dignity of someone who knows she's caused enough pain. She no longer tried to get closer, nor did she check in on him. She began to take care of herself more diligently. She sold her old apartment, packed her bags, and decided to start over somewhere else, a smaller, quieter city, where she wouldn't be remembered by sidelong glances or memories around every corner. There, she began working in a small bookstore. She met new people, some light friendships and others deeper, but no love story began there, and she didn't force it to begin. For the first time, Mariana was willing to be alone for as long as it took until she felt whole again. She wrote almost every day, no longer about pain, but about rebuilding. Her writings began to be read by other broken hearts, and she became, without realizing it, a reference for overcoming difficulties for people who would never have imagined the mistakes she made in the past. A year after that last meeting at the farm, Daniel and Mariana, each in their own corner, received an invitation to an art exhibition by a mutual friend. It was a discreet gallery, with paintings that spoke of human feelings with a quiet depth. Both hesitated to go, for different reasons, but ended up attending. When they saw each other, there was only a respectful greeting, brief but full of meaning. Neither of them was looking for anything more there. Daniel was with his new partner, and Mariana was alone, but with a presence she had previously lacked. They talked for a few minutes, commented on the beauty of one of the works, exchanged sincere smiles, and then went their separate ways within the same room. There was no resentment, no hope. There was something greater, acceptance. It was Mariana who left first. As she walked along the wet sidewalk after a light drizzle, she realized that time had done more for her than any excuse she could have offered. She understood, definitively, that not every loss is a punishment. Sometimes, it's the push life gives us to stop pretending we're okay with something that's already dead. She lost the love of her life, yes. But in the midst of that loss, she found herself. And that, in the end, was the least she could salvage after everything she'd caused. When she got home that night, she sat in the porch chair with a cup of tea and gazed at the starless sky. The loneliness was still there, but it no longer consumed her. She knew that true love only returns when it finds a clean space. And now, finally, she was beginning to clean it. After the event, Daniel returned home hand in hand with his new wife. In the car, she asked if he was okay, and he responded with a simple, genuine smile, saying yes. That night, he would write his first text after months of inactivity. The title was simple, yet weighty, The Things That Don't Come Back. The text began with a phrase he'd carried for a long time, but only now could write clearly: some loves don't end when they end, but when they stop recognizing us. And that was it. He hadn't stopped loving Mariana because of a mistake, but because of everything that mistake revealed: the lack of care, the absence, the ego. He learned that loving someone who doesn't know how to care for what they hold in their hands is like trying to keep warm with a torn blanket in the dead of winter. It will never be enough. And moving forward, with the serenity of someone who has rebuilt themselves after being broken, was the greatest act of self-love he could offer himself. The two moved on with their lives. They no longer crossed paths, no longer exchanged messages. But each carried within themselves the story they had written together. For Daniel, it was the hardest book to close, but also the most necessary. For Mariana, it was the most honest scar she would ever bear, not out of shame, but as a constant reminder that, when you betray someone, you often break not just the bond with the other person, but also your own conscience. The betrayal, in that case, was the turning point in a relationship that had already been losing itself in small, daily failures. But it didn't have to be the end. The end came the moment Mariana chose silence over immediate repentance, vanity over vulnerability. And there, when everything could have been saved, she missed the right time to return. And time, that cruel and implacable judge, does not come back for anyone. Now I want to know, what did you think of this story? Comment below with your opinion, what touched you most, which character you understood most, and how this story impacted you. And of course, if you enjoyed this content, subscribe to the channel now, because here you'll always find real, intense stories that will make you reflect on love, loss, choices, and, above all, the value of those who remain. This story teaches us a clear and painful lesson: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destabilizes families, erodes respect, silences affection, and buries what could have been eternal. A choice made in a few seconds can cost a lifetime of regret. May no one need to lose someone to understand the value of true love. And remember, this channel does not support, defend, or justify any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell stories to show what pain can teach, and to ensure it never happens again in your life.